quantity of it there was. Even by Christmas, the American and British counts had been completed. It was possible to start work then on a defense against accusations of conspiracy and waging aggressive war. For anyone still needing clarification of these accusations, summaries of cases against individuals on the first two counts had been presented in court in January. The evidence against each had been collated, printed, and circulated. There was plenty for the defendants and their lawyers to be getting on with before the French and Russian cases began. With such possibilities open to the defense, the tribunal could well believe that lawyers who had been so dilatory did not deserve 3 weeks' grace, though some undoubtedly needed it. Defendants or their counsel, however, have seldom mentioned these opportunities in memoirs or interviews. Instead, they have tended to concentrate on allegations of unfair practice hampering the possibility of an adequate defense. And many give the impression that they never had access to essential prosecution material. But in fact, after the initial muddle and incompetence of the early weeks, a steady flow of documents had been established. Before long, defense lawyers had been able to get the transcript of a day's court proceedings within 48 hours. Though only extracts from documents were read in court, each document was given an index number. It was easy to go to the document room and ask for a copy of the whole. Even when the demands on the copying equipment were heaviest, the request would be met after a week. Dr. Zeidel had gone so far as to register indignation that the defense was only allowed to see a mere photostat of an original document. He seems unaware that that rule applied to the prosecutors too. Originals were reserved for the tribunal alone. No one has shown that copies were not genuine or complete. Ribbentrop complained in his memoirs, written in Nuremberg jail, that one of the diaries of the Italian foreign minister, Ciano, which was used against him, was certainly a forgery, and that he could never find out whether the photocopies were based on the real or the fake version. He might have noticed in all the months he sat in court that every document submitted had to be accompanied by a certificate of its source and authenticity. Where there was real doubt, counsel could challenge authenticity in court. They frequently did so, sometimes successfully. The proper and effective time to complain was in court, not in memoirs. Besides, the complaints do not always stand up to examination. A recent German author, Werner Maser, has suggested that several defense counsel were horrified that so many prosecution documents were untranslated. He does not point out that though extracts might be read in court in English, French or Russian, they were translated into German by the simultaneous translators. They were printed in every language in the transcripts and document book. In any case, nearly all the documents were in German in the first place. If anyone should complain about lack of translations, and then only at the stage of preparation, it is the prosecutors. Maser is also ready to retail an accusation from Dönitz that thousands of documents which seemed likely possibly to incriminate the Allies and exonerate the defendants suddenly disappeared. Even if one ignores the folly of presuming that the court would have accepted tu quoque evidence, whatever others might have done, it did not legally cancel out or excuse criminal acts by the defendants. It is significant that Maser does not name a single document allegedly suppressed in this way. Any confidence in the accusation is destroyed when he goes on to say that they could only be removed by officers who were under the command of Colonel Andrews. Agent of sinister powers does not seem typecasting for Andrews, nor does Maser show any understanding of Andrews's actual powers and limits of authority in the courthouse. The whole story collapses when Maser repeats Dönitz's claim that his accusation was finally proved by what the author calls a source in Tahiti whose name cannot be given for obvious reasons. Too many of these complaints and allegations are either silly or actually dishonest. They do grave disservice to their cause because they detract from the sympathy which ought to be felt for the serious problems the defense experienced. Many of these stemmed from the handicap of working with such tiny staff. Prosecution teams added up to hundreds. Defense lawyers, on the other hand, were lucky if they could summon an assistant and a secretary. Thanks to their large pools of manpower, the prosecutors could both maintain a presence in court and find ample staffing for the work in their offices. The German counsel, by contrast, were obliged to sit in court all day, every day. The tribunal insisted they be available to guard their client's interests and cross-examine relevant witnesses. Meanwhile, an assistant or secretary would be left to struggle with the 101 jobs occasioned by the prosecution charges and evidence and the practical needs of the defense. Court attendance prevented daytime consultations with clients, while in court the lawyers could only exchange brief scribbled notes with defendants on matters of immediate concern. At lunchtime, counsel and defendants had to go their separate ways to their own canteens. This left only the hours after 5 o'clock, hours when everyone was tired and strained, for lawyers to consult their clients, to log the transcript, plow through the stacks of documents used by the prosecution, and to try to find their own evidence. Maxwell Fyfe told them, when they requested a 3-week recess, that no one could work up a case without burning some midnight oil. The German counsel undoubtedly had to burn very much more than their prosecution counterparts, who could call on so many assistants, researchers, and secretaries. Their use of midnight oil would have been more economical. The time available for preparation would have seemed longer, however, if defendants and their counsel had anguished less and put more thought into a practical approach to the needs of their defense, and had exploited the real advantages they possessed. The prosecution had clearly laid out the charges to be answered and the evidence on which they were based. The defense had been given lines to work along, limited areas which must be covered. They were not starting from scratch or thrashing around in the complete archive of the Third Reich, as the prosecutors had been, before they could determine what matters were relevant. More importantly, they were not shackled by the abysmal ignorance which had so impeded the prosecutors. They were Germans, working with their own history and on material in their own language. Their clients were the men who had shaped the policies and made the decisions against which prosecution allegations were directed. They were in the best position to give alternative explanations and analyses. Unlike the prosecutors, these men knew the chain of command, the machinery for decision, the distribution list for memos and orders. The prosecution had groped and blundered for months, trying to understand the structure of Nazi government and the armed forces. They had stumbled in and out of blind alleys before they could assemble a picture of Nazi policies and the involvement of individuals in them. Often it had been sheer chance, rather than understanding, which had enabled them to discover the minutes of meetings or documents recording orders. Knowledge painfully and sometimes only partially acquired by the prosecutors was already possessed by the defendants. Unfortunately, the defense seems to have insufficiently appreciated such advantages, and they did not develop what resources they had. Rather than concentrate on rebutting the specific allegations which had been made, too many defense lawyers devoted their time and zeal to obtaining and trying to use documents which they must have known would be declared inadmissible. They wanted Nazi government white books, official justification for policies backed by carefully selected and edited Allied documents. They chased evidence of crimes by others, such as the secret protocol to the Nazi-Soviet pact, or British plans for an invasion of Norway. Such material was all too obviously intended for a plea of tu quoque, and would never be accepted by the court. In spite of the prohibitions expressed in the Charter and repeated rulings by the tribunal, they put it into their document book and tried to slip it into the proceedings, even when permission to use individual documents had been refused after application. They then expressed outrage when the tribunal would not accept such evidence. Too many counsel relied on elaborate defenses constructed on German grievances about the Versailles Treaty and claims that it had ceased to be binding in any respect since others had failed to comply with its requirements on disarmament. This was to imply tu quoque and to stretch a single debatable point which, even if conceded, could in no way excuse the wide variety of alleged subsequent crimes. Papen recognized in his memoirs, "It is true that tu quoque is a bad defense," but went on to say that it seemed necessary to show whether certain international laws were respected at the time of his alleged crimes. This suggests the belief that if everyone breaks the law, it ceases to exist. Legal theory and practice have always shown otherwise. If, instead, Papen and the others had argued that there was no law to guide their behavior, or that existing law was too vague and ambiguous to be effective, they might have established a much sounder defense against some of the charges they faced. After all, several of the participants at the London conference had not been convinced that aggressive war was a crime in international law, even though they had succumbed to pressure to make it a charge. Those defendants who were to press this fundamental point of law in their cases were to make an effective showing. The fruitfulness of questioning what international laws existed to govern the defendants' policy and how their ambiguities had been open to different interpretations was demonstrated in the winning strategy devised by Kranzbühler, counsel for Dönitz, who also works on the legal bases of the naval case as a whole. He asked the tribunal's permission to send an interrogatory to the American Admiral Nimitz to ascertain what had been the actual practice of the American Navy in the Pacific. He got it. His request had been skillfully framed to avoid implications of tu quoque and to stress the need to establish current interpretations of uncertain naval law. Similarly, he convinced the tribunal of his right to apply to the British Admiralty for both German captured documents and for British naval papers. Again, he had based his request on the argument that where the law was acknowledged to be vague or disputed, it was necessary to examine actual practice. This application received backing from Maxwell Fyfe, who pointed out to the Admiralty that it would be helpful if Kranzbühler's assistant were allowed to look for the material he wanted in person. Otherwise, he suggested, no one would be convinced that Dönitz and Raeder had been given reasonable facilities to defend themselves. And nothing short of this will really be fair to the defense, or will completely satisfy them or the tribunal that justice has been done. The Foreign Office, often leery of revealing its own documents, seconded his request, though Mr. Troutbeck querulously inquired whether, if Ribbentrop's defending counsel asks permission to come over and examine the whole of the diplomatic documents in our possession, will he be allowed to do so? The tribunal's answer to such a request from Ribbentrop would have been no. They were sympathetic to requests for evidence which could be shown to be relevant, but they were not prepared to countenance what became known as fishing expeditions. They might well have permitted a trip to examine a limited number of documents in a few clearly specified areas, but it seems doubtful that Ribbentrop would ever have been capable of framing a sufficiently uncloudy and concrete request. Kranzbühler had set an example of how to get what was wanted by approaching the tribunal using the forms which they accepted. Other counsel were much too vague. They requested facilities provided by the General Secretary to copy mountains of documents, on the off chance they might discover the odd nugget in them. The tribunal had to remind them that, in order that time should not be wasted and money should not be wasted, it is necessary to show whether witnesses and documents have any shadow of relevance to the issues raised. All they asked was to be shown a shadow of relevance. They interpreted the rules of evidence very broadly. Not broadly enough for some people. Papen complained he was not allowed a complete set of cabinet minutes. Perhaps if he had asked only for those meetings he himself attended and shown why they were necessary, he would have got them. He also complained that he was not given his private papers, which had been left in Berlin and at Wallerfangen. Jacques, too, denounced the fact that he was not allowed access to the complete material which the Allies had confiscated from his personal archive. Again, a specific request might well have elicited a different response. Yet neither man actually names in his memoirs a single document from these ample stores which would have significantly improved his case. Conceivably, to be padded round with one's private papers at such a time might give a sense of security. Some might jog the memory or ease the process of seeing the design of a lifetime's work. It is, however, a sad possibility that those defendants and counsel who could never see the wood for the trees would have become even more confused if surrounded by a forest. All too many defendants registered grievance about lack of access to paper. About Fritzsche, for example, never thought to mention the help he received from the prosecution and the General Secretary when he was looking for letters he wrote to Himmler inquiring about rumors of extermination of the Jews. Nor did he record that every effort was made to obtain BBC recordings and transcripts of speeches he had made between 1933 and 1945. Unfortunately, the BBC could never afford to keep discs on which such recordings were made, and only began to monitor Nazi broadcasts in 1939, and then only kept brief summaries. This lack of evidence on the Fritcher case was to prove as frustrating to the prosecution as to the defense. Not surprisingly, no one since the trial has put into writing what one defense lawyer told Robert Kempner at the time, that he was afraid to look too thoroughly into his client's papers in case he turned up yet more incriminating material. The defense has, however, very properly recorded a genuine impediment to their work: the need to apply openly to the tribunal for documents and witnesses, and to submit their requests to argument from the prosecution. This procedure undoubtedly saved time and trouble later in court, but it robbed the defense of the element of surprise. It forewarned the prosecution of the line the defendants would take, and showed them the exact contribution which the evidence was intended to make. The prosecution thus had time to prepare their counterclaims, to study defense documents, and find their own to challenge them, to research the backgrounds of witnesses and design effective cross-examination. Since so many potential defense witnesses were prisoners of war, they could be interrogated. The system of open application resulted in the defense having to reveal most of its cards before playing its hand. And not all defense complaints about tribunal processing of defense requests are justified, however. Maser expresses indignation that only 4 of Jodel's 19 applications for witnesses were granted, on grounds of time, he says. Concern about time was not at the root of the tribunal's decision. The rule which they stated again and again was that the evidence to be given by a witness should neither be cumulative nor irrelevant. Exactly the same rule had been applied to the prosecution. Witnesses must also present evidence on matters germane to the issues of the trial. When Seyss-Inquart's counsel applied for 37 witnesses to show his client had averted atrocities and mitigated the severity of Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, the judges pointed out that the prosecution had not actually offered any evidence on crimes there. If he insisted on dealing with Seyss-Inquart's governorship, he must select a reasonable number of witnesses who have general knowledge of the conditions he wishes to prove. To request 37 for this purpose was hardly reasonable, nor were many of the requests made by Ribbentrop. They gave the impression he was arranging one of his smart cocktail parties in his London embassy, rather than preparing a defense. He wanted to call the Duke of Windsor, the Duke of Buccleuch, Lord Derby. Since he could think of no good reason for their summons, he was not allowed to issue it. His application for Winston Churchill was turned down too. Ribbentrop was not the only defendant to want the former Prime Minister, and, like the others, he failed to counter the prosecution argument that he could not provide any relevant grounds for Churchill to appear. There was no argument over his request for Lord Dawson of Penn or Geoffrey Dawson, once the editor of the Times. Both were dead. But there was some debate about his wish to call Lords Vansittart, Londonderry, Beaverbrook and Kemsley. For once, Ribbentrop's interest was less in their titles than in what he hoped they might say about his desire for Anglo-German cooperation and hopes for peace, which he claimed to have shown both as ambassador and foreign minister. Maxwell Fyfe warned the Foreign Office that these requests might well be granted by the tribunal and asked for guidance. The Foreign Office view was the same as the one they expressed when Goering applied for Lord Halifax, Sir Alexander Cadogan and Sir George Ogilvy IV, once councillor in Berlin. They saw no reason to prevent those in private life giving evidence for the defense, although they felt there might be a chance to plead public policy to prevent serving officials having to attend the trial. When a man was on trial for his life, it would be unreasonable to deny him such witnesses. But appearances in court could be avoided if all the eminent gentlemen agreed to answer defense interrogatories. They did so. The questions were forwarded to them, often with helpful suggestions from Professor Woodward as to their answers. There was consternation when those of Lord Londonderry were returned, together with a bill for £5 6 shillings from a notary who had come to his home